Okay. Well, here's hoping this works. Anyway, let me get where you can see me. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really thrilled that we were able to make this connection and that you were able to make the time. We've got a nice group of people here, many of whom have read the book, some of whom have not. We told them that they don't need to have read the book to enjoy today's discussion. However, we also want to thank you for sending us these photographs, which you cannot see. Here, I'll fix that. Which tell an interesting story unto themselves. And without further ado, I think what I'd like to do is have you introduce yourselves to the group so that we know a little bit more about you, and then we can get right into the program.
Right, that's great. Thank you for that. Can you see us all right? Because we...
Yes.
Yes.
I can't see. Wait a minute.
Hold on.
You just turned off the sound.
Yeah, brilliant. There we go.
Oh, that's
Much
a lot
better.
better. That's really good. You're all a bit pixelated, but you look fine now. So, right, yes, I'll introduce myself. I'm Amanda Bennett, the Chief Librarian of the Prior Library. It's lovely to do this. And sitting to my right is June Money, whose book Aspects of War some of you may have had a chance to look at, which is extremely useful guide to anybody looking at the period of German occupation in Guernsey. And behind me here is Molly B.A. Would you like to take a seat, Molly?
That's it. Yeah. That's the one.
And Molly's written some very popular books about her childhood experiences of the occupation in Guernsey, and she's fascinating to listen to. And to my left here is Sue Laker, who's the Deputy Chief Librarian of the Prior Library. She's extremely knowledgeable about the occupation, and she's sort of my right-hand woman, and I can't do anything without her, so that's why she's here as well. So would you like to take a seat?
Yes.
Whoever's going to be speaking will sort of sit in pole positions. We might move around a little bit. If you're happy for me to just launch into it.
Yes,
Right then, Molly, would you like to take a seat?
It's a comfortable seat here, Molly.
And then we'll move around so you can see whoever's speaking at any given point. I think Molly's a bit off the screen at the moment. Okay. For those of you who've read the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society, how many of you have read it? Quite a few, or lots of hands went up. That's great. It was a while ago that it came out now. It was something like 8 years ago, I think it was first published. So I very quickly reread it when I knew that this was going to happen. And it reminded me that maybe many of you hadn't heard of Guernsey before you read the book, or at least hadn't really known a lot about the island before you read the book. As you probably gathered from the book, it's a very small island. It's only 25 square miles, which is, in terms of America, very, very small indeed. But it's quite densely populated. I think the latest figures are something like 64,000 people live on the island. So compared to your area, I think Hillsdale is something like 2,000 people, is that right? So it's quite different in the geographical makeup. Yes, well, the reason we think that the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society was such a phenomenon was not only because it was such a charming story, but because it maybe highlighted some aspects of Guernsey history that nobody had really considered before, which was the German occupation. And it is a fascinating period in Guernsey's history. But Guernsey has a very, very long history. It's very old. It's got some of the oldest evidence of human habitation in Europe, going back something like 8,000 years. So it's been home to people for a very, very long time indeed. And but it's got lots of cultural and social influences which make it fascinating as well, which are brought out somewhat in the novel. Victor Hugo, that great French writer who wrote Les Miserables, and in fact he completed Les Miserables when he lived in Guernsey for many years. He wrote a book about the Channel Islands in which he said that the Channel Islands were little pieces of France that were thrown into the ocean and picked up by Britain, which is essentially correct. When the Channel Islands became geographically separated from mainland France, and I think Alderney is only 20 miles from the French coast. Here in Guernsey, we're a bit further away. They became geographically separated over many millennia, and they maintained political and geographical links with mainland France, and at that time, which was the Duchy of Brittany, and later the Duchy of Normandy. So they were essentially French, and the people that lived here were French of Norman descent. But during the early medieval period, and the great William the Conqueror, who conquered England for the Duchy of Normandy, the Norman Islands, as they were then, essentially became part of the British Crown or the English Crown. And we actually owe our allegiance today to Elizabeth II as her title, under her title of Duke of Normandy, rather than her title of Queen of England. So that's quite a sort of archaic and interesting aspect of Guernsey history. So when the Duchy of Normandy and the Crown of England eventually separated a couple of centuries later, after William the Conqueror, the islands chose to remain with Britain rather than with France. But we kept our essential French character, so in Guernsey even today you get this blending of a French, Norman cultural heritage and language, and a very sort of fervent allegiance with the British Crown. So it's quite an interesting melting pot, really, of cultural influences. Now, I think that's brought over slightly in the novel, but maybe not as much as I've stressed here. As I said, Guernsey is very small. Before I sort of talk a bit more about its sort of political history, I just thought it's worth mentioning, because I know that the United States of America is very rich in its geographical diversity and its landscapes and its flora and fauna, whereas Guernsey, being in a small island which separated off from the mainland France quite early on, is not quite so diverse. So you may not know that we don't have any toads on the island, and we don't have any snakes. Jersey, which separated slightly later on than Guernsey, does have toads, and it does have snakes, well, it has grass snakes. There's only one breed of snake that it has. As a consequence, Guernsey people tend to call Jersey people crapaud, which is the Norman French for toad. So that's our nickname for our sister island. But we don't need to talk about Jersey. And we also don't have any foxes, we don't have any badgers, and we don't have any moles. I think that's all of them. Yeah. So as you can see, it's although we don't have any large rodents or mammals of that nature, it's interesting in its own way. But I thought that was worth mentioning. The history of Guernsey being part of the British Crown but not part of the British Isles. Oh well, yes, part of the British Isles but not part of the United Kingdom. It's sort of a halfway house, really. We're part of the Commonwealth, but we're not part of the European Union. There's lots of things that Guernsey sits in the middle of. So we like to have our cake and eat it, which is how we like to put it sometimes. So Guernsey is a small island, and I think when you live on a small island, it's a very marginal existence. We're dependent on the sea for our livelihood, but it's also a threat to us. It protects us, but it's also dangerous. So that's the nature of island life. that it can be precarious even in the modern world. Today is going to be very stormy, so they've cancelled all the ferry sailings. So, we're essentially cut off by the sea today. And that happens quite often. So, even in the 21st century, it's a marginal existence. And for our ancestors many centuries ago, it would have been a much more marginal existence. And small communities can't always make and create everything themselves in order to survive. So Guernsey has had to find lots of different ways to survive, and they've done that politically and economically, socially. So they've always had interesting trades or interesting ways of exploiting a current trade in order to make enough money to survive in the modern world. In the 15th and 16th century, it was the stocking trade. Guernsey women would knit stockings for export. And in fact, it's said that Mary Queen of Scots, when she went to the scaffold to be executed, was wearing a pair of Guernsey woolen stockings. I don't know if that's true or not. In the 17th and 18th century, trade became increasingly important. Guernsey had always, as part of the British Crown, owed allegiance to the Crown, but was allowed to be neutral in times of war. But the neutrality couldn't last forever, and Guernsey people realised that not being neutral could actually make them a bit of money. And it was during the 7 Years' War in the 18th century that they realised that if they fought on the side of the British Crown, they could actually make a bit of money for themselves. So many of the Guernsey sailors registered as privateers, which is a fancy name for a pirate, basically. It's a licensed pirate. So you get a license or a letter of marque from the Crown, which allowed you to attack enemy ships, and the booty from that could be shared amongst your crew and the owner of the ship. And many Guernsey families made a great deal of money, particularly in the end of the 18th century, and sometimes often against American ships, it has to be said. They would make a great deal of money from privateering, and a great deal of wealth was built up in the island. And there's a lot of legitimate trade went on as well. Guernsey is blessed with a very deep natural harbour, which means that big ships can get in and out on almost any tide. And it meant that Guernsey, as a stopping off point between England and the continent, became a very important international port with lots of trade moving to and from its docks in the 18th and 19th century. So again, a great deal of money came in and out of the island. And it meant that St. Peter Port was really far more international than is sometimes given it credit. So that's really how the sea gave us our livelihood. Moving into the 20th century, well, the 19th and 20th century, lots of other industries took its place. We had the granite industry. Guernsey granite is very hard, and you need specialists to quarry it, but it was exported all over the world. Many millions of tons were exported in the early 20th century. That trade is sort of non-existent now, really. But then out of its place grew the growing industry, and particularly Guernsey tomatoes, which were very big in the 30s, 40s, 50s, up into the 1970s, and then they declined, and that trade declined in the early 1980s. Tourism was very important after the war. That's been somewhat in decline, but it's still important now. And today it's the finance industry which keeps our head above water, financially speaking. So that's really sort of Guernsey in a nutshell. I could go on and on for hours, but I won't, because there's far more important things to talk about.
So Amanda,
I really would like
that was a wonderful introduction. I need to make a technical change because I need to switch the mic to the camera because I'm not sure I'm picking up your audio. So you can wait for 1 second.
No problem.
think I'll be able to understand.
Well, if you just talk and then... Yes, if you talk, don't worry if you can't hear.
Okay.
Yeah.